Right, thank you all for being here. I'm going to speak a lot about gender violence, actually, so I'm going to take this as an example of groups that are vulnerable and for whom we actually are acting, intervening. So in 2005 at the World Summit, all member states of the United Nations acknowledged the importance of a third pillar of a responsibility to protect concept, which is triggered when states are, and I quote, manifestly failing to protect their populations from genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity. So Pillar 3 of the R2P allows for collective action, and I quote again, in a timely and decisive manner through the Security Council in accordance with the Charter, including Chapter 7. So the problem what we have here is actually more fundamentally the concept of responsibility assumes that there is a population that needs protecting. That's the idea, responsibility to protect. And that actually gives the impression that the population is unable to protect itself. So in other words, the international community intervenes when the population is deemed vulnerable, hence that use of a word. And over the years, we've seen increasing references, especially in discourse, political discourse, made to vulnerable groups. We are intervening to protect women, to protect children, to protect ethnic minorities, and so on and so forth. So with a view to protecting them. I, however, posit that there is quite some disparity between the rhetoric of protecting people who are vulnerable or deemed vulnerable, that's another discussion, and especially women. That's one side. Then the law that is contained in the UN reports and United Nations Security Council, and I will focus on these ones. And then there is the reality. So three of them do not match at all, according to me. So let's start with the legal framework. So it's very clear that if a certain threshold is reached, that is, that we have certain crimes, that the third pillar of the R2P is to be activated or can be activated. Okay, I'm not even going on whether there's an obligation. At least we are sure that an intervention is permissible. That's the first thing I would like to say. So it becomes really important to be able to designate the situation as falling into one of the R2P crimes. So I argue that there's no doubt that gender crimes that affect women fall within the R2P crimes and can thus reach the required threshold for a permissible intervention. So if you look at various UN Secretary General reports on R2P, they have recognized the linkage between the four crimes that we have and sexual and gender-based violence. So we even can go back to the first report of 2009 that does mention, in fact, gender-based violence. And more recently, the 2020 report is the first report we have that is focused on women, the first R2P report on women. And it spells out that the atrocity crimes that fall under the responsibility to protect agenda entail a gender perspective and have a gender impact. Yes, we've got it. And explain that it is no longer disputed that widespread or systematic sexual violence may constitute atrocity crimes. So very clearly this link is being made. But more importantly, that report actually also tells us that states, and I quote here, individually or collectively through the international community have a responsibility to prevent. Interesting. Notice prevent, not protect. I'll come back to this later. To support this conclusion, I'd like to remind you that the various UN reports present a discourse that supports intervention when groups are disproportionately affected by the four R2P crimes. So, for example, the 2020 R2P report on women reiterates that genocide, war crimes, ethnic cleansing, and crimes against humanity affect men, women, girls, and boys differently. In fact, when you look at academics, they also have stressed that women and children are disproportionately affected by armed conflict, and they suffer in a different way. They suffer by being targeted, but also through what they call second and third order of conflicts, lack of medicine, of food, shelter, and forced migration. I'll come back to that later. So if anything, the vulnerability of this group is stress. So we would be expecting that these groups are more likely to be protected, that there is more likelihood that there is going to be some form of intervention. So that conclusion seems to be quite different from what a lot of scholars have been saying, and a lot of feminist scholars, I'm going to talk about them a bit, who actually thinks that R2P is gender blind. And that there is, and I quote here, there is minimal international legal recognition that the use of rape and sexual assault, including forced marriage, outside of an ethnic basis triggers the international community's responsibility to protect. So my question is, I've just proven to you that the R2P crimes can include gender-based violence, and at the same time we're saying it doesn't work. So what's the problem here, actually? Well, if you look at the UN documents, you actually notice that a lot of the gender-based violence references are made to pre-conflict situations, nothing to do with the intervention phase at all. So, and it starts with the first R2P report on 2009 mentions, in fact, gender-based violence, but it's always about something that happens before the conflict. And you think, wow, 2020 reports on women, fantastic watershed, we are going to do something. Well, actually, no. Because if you look at it, paragraph 5 says, the focus is on the implementation of a responsibility to protect under pillars 1 and 2. Nothing about 3, again. So they are really focused, with gender-based violence is not really linked to intervention at all. And that is where there is a missing link. And also, if you look at the Security Council, it has never linked the third pillar of R2P to gender-based violence and the threshold there. There are references, don't get me wrong, to gender-based violence in the various UN Security Council resolutions, loads of them actually, but not in relation to intervention. And I'll give you an example about South Sudan. So there were 2 resolutions adopted this year, one in March, one in May 2023. And it refers, so it expressed concern for, and I quote, violations and abuses, including those involving gender-based violence, continue to occur, which may amount to international crimes, including war crimes and crimes against humanity. Great. But that reference is actually in relation to the first pillar of R2P. It is in relation to the state's obligation to ensure that these crimes are not being committed. It is not in relation to intervention. So that is where the problem is. And I'll go even further in details about the practice of the Security Council. Yesterday we talked about the Yazidi women in Iraq, in Syria. So I'm going to go and use this example. So I think there's no doubt that maybe there's some doubt, some people will disagree with me, but I think that when ISIS was actually going into these villages, it was explicitly targeting women because they were women, rather than because they had a certain ethnicity or a certain religion. And ISIS' first discriminating factors, in my opinion, was that they were women. That's it. So yet the Security Council did not seize the opportunity. And the Security Council said we are condemning, strongest term, gender-based violence against these women, but didn't take any action. Actually, when it took action, it said to take all necessary measures, so we have this vocabulary of intervention, but nothing about the women, to redouble and coordinate their efforts to prevent and suppress terrorist acts, and to eradicate the safe haven that they have established over significant parts of Iraq and Syria. So no relation. Yes, we're intervening, but it's not because of a women, whereas the discourse was about protection of women. And this, to some quarters of academia, sends the unintended message that gender-based violence actually is not really important and doesn't warrant an armed intervention. So as I said, we have a problem between the claim that interventions are for the protection of vulnerable groups. We also have a problem that it's always mentioned in the first and the second pillar, and not in the third pillar. So I'll go to something slightly different, because I'm a bit upset that we changed R2P, to be honest. I quite like the fact that R2P was about protect, react, and rebuild. And we dropped the rebuild. And I think we need the rebuild. Maybe we can do an RP4, I don't know. But there's a problem about what is happening in the post-intervention space. So once you have actually intervened, what are we doing? And I think that we have 4 problems, 4 tensions that I'd like to mention here. And I'm going to again use the example of women to show you what the problems are after the intervention. And this is something when we're talking about how successful a humanitarian intervention is that, something we're interested in, or how many people were saved by the humanitarian intervention. I think we really need to look at that. So my first tension, so to say, my first problem I have is that we deem these groups to be vulnerable. So we think that they need protection. But somehow, in the post-intervention space, we say, you've got to be active, you have to play an active role. And there's a problem there between the two. So either they are vulnerable and hopeless and whatever, or we see them like this, all be really active and they can take a seat at the table. So there is fundamentally a question about what is R2P for. And a lot of academics, not lawyers, have actually questioned that. Some of them have said that, well, actually humanitarian intervention is neocolonialism dressed in human rights. That is quite of a complaint that is made. The scholars who have been working on the women, peace and security agenda, they completely refuse to engage with R2P because they say it is a justification of military intervention. We don't want military intervention in the first place, so leave that aside. Some other scholars will say that, oh, it's all about discourse of patriarchy, that views women as vulnerable, unable to protect themselves and in need of protection. And indeed, this is a bit what we find in some of the original UN reports, that there was some sort of sexist stereotypes about women having no agency, that they needed to be protected. And this has quite changed over the time, thank God. And the idea is that women need to be involved in the post-conflict process. And why do we involve them? Because the idea, and I quote the 2023 report on R2P, is because national peace-building strategies aimed at the prevention of conflict and post-conflict recovery are most effective if they include the full representation and participation of populations that have experienced or are at elevated risk of atrocity crime. And we know women have been disproportionately suffering in the conflict, so it makes sense to ensure their full participation in the peace-building process. But actually, this makes no sense when you initially portray them as useless and having no agency. So they seem to be almost like an automatic switch. They are vulnerable, and after the humanitarian intervention, they are not vulnerable anymore. They are full agent, and they have to fully participate in public life. So this is one of the first tensions I think is quite problematic. And that is in fact linked to my second tension. So the United Nations has recognized the important role played by women in the post-intervention space, there's no doubt about it, but it actually struggles to tackle the underlying structural inequalities that often lead to conflicts. There's no doubt that the UN has recognized the important role played by women, so the 2020 report on R2P makes plenty of references to women's full and equal participation in decision-making, peace processes, that the perspective of women and protection strategies for the risk assessments are really, really important. So yes, it is the discourse that is said, and that we want to have gender equality. The report, the 2020 report, actually even gives us data, which is quite good, and it shows that, and I quote, the involvement of women in conflict prevention is essential for achieving lasting, just, and sustainable peace by broadening political dialogues, enabling their voices to be heard and their priorities to be taken into account. And actually, independent research does prove that there is a link between including women and fewer or reducing the risk of violence and notably atrocity crimes. So I'm not disputing the data, that full participation of women does reduce the occurrence of violence. But what I'd like to point out is that we're saying when they are involved. And very often they are not involved. And that is a problem. So how to get them, in fact, to come to the table. So it is not a problem, but it's, I think, a bit naive of the United Nations to think that there is this automatic switch, that women are going all of a sudden to be there, present, active, and be able to actually participate in the public life. The report, and the 2020 report in particular, brushes away completely structural problems. And it doesn't even talk about women being underrepresented and so on and so forth. It's only in the conclusion, I mean, this is quite telling, the conclusion explains actually what should be in the beginning, which is that women are still underrepresented, underestimated in government decision-making and in the rule of law and security sectors. They continue to face social pressure, stigmatization, abuse, and exploitation. I think the report should start with this and not finish with that, because that's a problem. You have first to identify the problem and then sort it out, not the other way around. So for a lot of feminists, the idea is that the very reason we have these structural problems is the concept of gender. So adopting a gender perspective will enable us to better understand the distribution of power between men and women, but also the wider societal structures and behaviors in that particular place. So gender, I just remind you, is usually defined as referring to socially constructed norms that explain what masculinity is, what femininity is, and it sets some expectations, some roles for both women and men, and it privileges one group over another. So in other words, women's role in society is based on these expectations. And in the post-intervention phase, whoever intervenes has no time to tackle these structural problems. There is no time for this. And we've seen this, that a lot of when the United Nations is leaving, it hasn't actually tackled the underlying drivers of violence and of atrocity crimes. And we know that from the United Nations that actually gender violence is one of the early warning factors to show that there is likely to be atrocity crimes being committed. So we're actually almost going in a full cycle, which is not good at all. We know that there's a strong correlation with this. So what I would say, we need to discuss more fundamentally the structural inequalities if we really want women to come into public life. The third tension is that those intervening, whilst professing an all-inclusive and bottom-up approach towards the restoration of peace, often adopt a binary, gendered view of women. So we find this not only in the United Nations, but also in the United Nations document, but also on the ground. So there is a principle of inclusivity within the peace process in the associated local term. I can't remember, we discussed that at some stage also. But actually, when you look at the R2P documents, women are always portrayed as victims. The ICES report actually framed women as victims, and more specifically as victims of rape. That's only how we saw them. And specialists in gender studies, so not lawyers, argue that this predominant view is based on the socially constructed notions of masculinity, linked with agency, and femininity, linked with victimhood. And that report, actually all these reports do stand in stark contrast with the women, peace and security agenda that actually wants women to come to the fore based on the experience on the ground. And the WPS agenda, it's all about becoming a security, an agent of protection. So the 2020 UN report on R2P and women finally breaches that gap, at least on the paper. It understands women more fully. So we don't have women just as victims. It captures the full range and the complexity of the role that women play in prevention, protection, and participation. And there is an entire paragraph, I couldn't believe it, on women as perpetrators. Not that I find this is amazing, okay, that women are perpetrators or men, whatever. But there is an entire paragraph on this. And this actually shows that they understand how women are, not only victims. So it offers a more refined and less gendered view of women's roles. In practice, on the ground, there is definitely the problem that women, as I said before, have issues with societal stigma, discrimination, and access to institutions, so we can't really speak in public life. So back to the idea of structural issues. And also another problem we have is that the forces that intervene quite often think that women don't have a skill set, that women are not really important. We need to talk to those who started the conflict, men, so these are the ones to be included in the peace process, and we'll deal with women later. And in other cases, what we have seen is that the intervening power will talk to the local and they will adopt the local views on women, which is also quite problematic, but at the same time, it is a bottom-up approach. So that is another tension. The last one is that in the post-intervention phase, there seems to be a dichotomy between the issues that are prioritized by the international community and actually the concerns of the local population, and especially women and children. So the international community always focuses on the macro level. It takes center stage. We are there about restoration of peace and security, accountability of the These are the two words. After a conflict, we're always looking at these two. But actually what women want is not really on the radar of it. And if you look at it, most of the R2P reports are indeed about bringing peace, the security, reform of the security sector and so on, accountability, redress, can we create a court and so on. And we want women to be involved. But I'm not saying that this is wrong, okay? But I think the main problem of women at the time is everyday life, more than these grand ideas. I understand they need to be involved in that. But very often, they are on their own. They are the sole breadwinners in the family. They take care of children, elderly relatives. Most of the men are dead, unable to work. So they are really, and you look at especially refugee camps, something like 80 or 90% of the population in refugee camps are women. So they are the ones who are taking care of pretty much everything in the country. And you see the UN reports, they acknowledge some of these difficulties, but they don't see them as priorities. So a 2020 UN report on R2P and women speaks about the lasting physical and psychological effects of atrocity crimes on individuals and recognize that they need medical assistance. But yes, but it's not a priority. Actually, for women, it is. They talk about trafficking, and we know that women and girls are disproportionately affected by trafficking during and after the conflict, and yet it's not made a priority, but they disappear. And I could go on and on like this for, to give you plenty of issues that are really relevant for women, but are not really deemed important on the international stage and by the intervener, so to say. And as a result, they feel further discriminated against, further alienated. They think they're not part of that community. So I'll leave you with one quote, which is, "The exercise of armed international agency in defense of the vulnerable has a decidedly uneven track record, and peacekeeping itself has proven to be an awkward and imperfect instrument of protection." Thank you very much.